Have you ever uncovered a secret in your life, something so hidden that it changes everything you thought you knew? Imagine, after decades of living with someone, discovering something that was always just out of reach, something that could change your view of the past forever. Today, I want to share a story with you that's filled with unexpected twists, heartbreak, and, most importantly, the power of discovering the truth. Stay with me as we dive into a journey that might just remind you of your own life's untold stories. A true story about this grandma. Enjoy a family secret that has been forgotten for decades. The beginning. A mysterious moment. It was one of those quiet evenings in the small town of Elmwood, where the world seemed to slow down as the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle overhead. The air had the crispness of autumn, and the rustling of leaves could be heard faintly through the old trees lining the road. On the porch of a house that had witnessed decades of life, a figure sat alone in a weathered rocking chair. The figure was an elderly woman. Her name was Daisy. Daisy had seen many seasons come and go. Now in her early 80s, her body was frail, and her hair had turned the color of winter snow, but her eyes, though tired, still held a spark of something far deeper, a knowing, perhaps, or a longing for something that she could not quite put into words. The house, like her, had aged with grace and wear. Its wooden floors creaked under the weight of time, and the scent of old books and the faintest trace of lavender clung to the air. On that particular evening, however, there was a stillness to the world around her, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Daisy sat in the rocking chair, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was far from still. Her gaze was fixed on the old oak tree in the yard, a tree that had stood there longer than she could remember, witnessing every major event of her life. For a long time, it had been a symbol of strength, of continuity, and of home. But now, tonight, something in the air felt different. As she looked at the tree, a shiver ran through her spine. It was almost as if the wind was whispering a secret to her, a secret that had been hidden for too long, a secret that she had been too afraid to face. Her hands trembled as she reached out to grab the old woolen blanket draped over the armrest of the chair. The cool evening air was biting, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was something else, something deep within her, something stirring after years of being buried. There was a feeling rising within her, a feeling that had been creeping up ever since she had discovered the old family chest in the attic last week. It had been tucked away in a corner, covered with dust and forgotten papers. She had no particular reason to open it that day, other than the fact that she had been cleaning out the attic, reminiscing about things long past. When she lifted the lid of the chest, the scent of old wood and leather hit her, and beneath it, she had found something that she had almost forgotten. A collection of letters, photographs, and diaries that told the story of a family she had known so well, yet so distantly. The names and faces of people long gone stared back at her, their lives captured in faded ink. But one photograph caught her eye more than the others. It was a picture of her, taken when she was young. In the photo, she stood with a man, George, her late husband, and a child she couldn't quite place. She had forgotten about this photo, and yet something about it felt wrong. The child was not one of her own, and yet there was an undeniable connection in the way she held the child, a connection she couldn't explain. As she stared at the photo, memories she had pushed aside for years began to resurface. The memories were like shards of glass, sharp and unyielding. She could remember the warmth of the child's small hand in hers, the sound of laughter that echoed through the house, but she couldn't remember the name, the circumstances, or why this child had been in her life in the first place. And now, years later, that picture had brought all those forgotten questions rushing back, questions that had never truly been answered. Who was that child? And why had she never asked about them? Daisy's mind raced as she sat there, the weight of the mystery growing heavier with every passing minute. Her thoughts drifted back to the past, to the life she had lived with George, to the family they had built together. But there was always a piece of her past that had been left unexplored, a part of her history that she had never fully understood. And now, that part of her life was calling out to her, demanding to be acknowledged. It was as if the winds of time were urging her to seek the truth, to face the secrets that had remained hidden for far too long. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the photograph again, her fingers brushing over the glass frame. For a moment, she hesitated. Could she really open that door again? Could she face whatever lay behind it? The thought of the unknown terrified her. She had spent so many years living in the safety of ignorance, never asking questions, never probing too deeply. But now, the time had come. The truth had a way of creeping up on you, even when you weren't looking for it. As she stared at the photo once more, she realized that she could no longer pretend that the past didn't matter. The mystery of that child, the unanswered questions, had always been there, lurking in the background. And now, it was time to bring it into the light. Daisy closed her eyes, her hand still gripping the photo. A single tear slid down her cheek, a tear for the years lost, for the secrets kept, and for the love she had never fully understood. But in that moment, as the wind howled softly in the distance, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She could no longer keep running from the past. The truth was waiting, and it was time for Daisy to find it, no matter where it led. The heart of the matter, Daisy's life today. Daisy sat in her rocking chair, the old wood creaking with each gentle sway. The house, though worn, still held the warmth of a time long past. She looked around at the familiar walls, the faded wallpaper that had once been vibrant, the heavy curtains that now hung like relics of a different era. The place had always been home, a home filled with the echoes of laughter, the smells of baking bread, and the soft murmur of conversations in the evening. But now, it felt a bit emptier. Not physically, but emotionally. She wasn't sure when it had happened exactly. When had the house, once bustling with the sounds of children and the light footfalls of a husband, grown so still? When had the laughter faded into silence, and the warmth of a shared life turned into the cold solitude that filled every room? Daisy was accustomed to this silence now. She had learned to live with it, and in many ways it had become a companion. But there were days, like today, when the silence seemed louder than usual, almost unbearable. Her mind wandered, as it often did, back to the days when life had been full of purpose, full of meaning, back when George was still with her, and they would sit by the fire in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing at all. Those had been the days of certainty, of knowing exactly what was next. And then, when George had passed, it was like the world had turned on its axis, and everything she knew, everything she relied on, had shifted. At 82, Daisy had learned to accept change, but she wasn't sure she would ever get used to it. She still remembered the phone call, that one phone call that changed everything. It had been nearly 15 years ago, but the memory was still so vivid. The doctor's voice, steady but compassionate, telling her that George had passed away in his sleep. Just like that, the man she had spent decades building a life with was gone. She had spent the first few weeks in a daze, walking through the house, touching the things he had left behind, unable to believe he was really gone. The children had tried to comfort her, but Daisy had always been a private person. They meant well, but their lives had moved on, and she didn't want to burden them. They had their own families, their own homes, their own lives. So she had settled into a routine. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. And with each passing year, the house felt emptier. The quiet grew louder, but she had become accustomed to it, or so she thought. In the mornings, she would wake early, as she always had, and prepare a cup of tea. She would sit at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden, which had once been George's pride and joy. The flowers he had planted still bloomed, though now they were a little wild, a little untamed, just like her own thoughts. She would watch the birds flit about, listen to the rustling of the leaves, and let her mind wander. There were so many things she had never said to George, so many words left unspoken. After tea, she would tend to the house, dusting the furniture, sweeping the floors, straightening things that had been out of place for years. It was a way to keep busy, to fill the time. In the evenings, she would take a walk around the property, the same route she had walked 1,000 times before. She would pass by the old oak tree, the one that had stood like a silent sentinel over their lives, and sometimes, just sometimes, she would swear it looked different, like it was waiting for something. But Daisy didn't allow herself to dwell on it. Not for long, anyway. Life had gone on, in its quiet, predictable way, and she had learned to live with the grief, though it still lingered in the background, like an old friend who refused to leave. There were good days, days when she felt content, when the quiet wasn't so heavy. But then, there were days when the weight of it all pressed down on her, when the emptiness of the house felt too vast to bear. Her children, all grown now, lived far away. Tim, her eldest, had settled in Chicago with his family. Kate, her daughter, was in California with her husband and children. And little Sam, well, he was still in the city, but he was always too busy to come by, caught up in his own life. They all visited when they could, of course, but it was never the same. The house had been built for a family, but now it felt too large for just one person, too empty. As Daisy sat in her chair, her thoughts drifted to the old chest she had found in the attic. She had been going through some of George's old things, sorting through papers and boxes that had accumulated over the years. It wasn't anything unusual. She often did it, trying to organize and make sense of the clutter. But when she opened that chest, she had felt something shift. The photograph had caught her off guard, and the moment she saw it, a flood of memories and questions came rushing back. Who was the child in that photo? Why hadn't she ever asked about them before? It was a strange thing to think about, a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight for all these years. There were so many things Daisy didn't understand, and this was one of them. She had spent so many years looking forward, focusing on the present, trying to live in the now. But now, the past was tugging at her, asking for her attention. It was a secret, a piece of her life that she had never fully explored, and for the first time, Daisy wondered if it was time to uncover it. Her fingers tightened around the photograph again, her heart racing slightly. She had never spoken of this child to anyone, not to her children, not to her friends, not even to George. It wasn't that she had forgotten about them. No, it was more that the memory had been locked away, hidden deep within the recesses of her mind. But now, with the photograph in her hands, the past was rising to the surface once more, and she had no idea what to do with it. Perhaps it was time to finally face the past, to confront the secrets that had been buried for so long. Maybe it was time to ask the questions she had avoided for years. The truth had a way of finding you, even when you weren't looking for it. As Daisy sat there, the rocking chair creaking beneath her, the house around her growing darker with the setting sun, she realized that the time for silence had passed. The questions were too loud now, too persistent. She couldn't ignore them any longer. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find out the truth. And whatever it was, she would face it. Family and the story of us. Daisy leaned back in her rocking chair, the wooden frame groaning slightly as she gazed out at the familiar landscape of her backyard. The evening had settled in, and the orange glow of the setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and purple. It was moments like this, when the world seemed to slow down, that Daisy felt both a deep peace and a quiet longing. The house around her had been a witness to so much. The laughter of children, the quiet companionship of a loving husband, the bustling noise of family gatherings, and the silence that had slowly crept in when those moments had faded away. As the years went on, the house had become a sanctuary of memories. It was a place filled with stories, each corner holding something special, something that belonged to the family she had once known so well. George, her husband, had been the heart of their family. He was a gentle man, with a kind smile and a steady presence that had grounded her through the ups and downs of life. They had been married for nearly 50 years, a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and shared dreams. Together, they had raised 3 children, Tim, Kate, and Sam, and the house had been full of life during those years. Daisy remembered the early days of their marriage, the excitement of building a home together, the late nights spent talking about their hopes for the future. They were young, full of dreams, and life felt boundless. The first few years were tough. They lived in a modest apartment, scraping by. But they were happy. The sound of their first child, Tim, crying in the next room was a reminder that they were building something real, something that would last. The years passed, and with each passing year, their family grew. Tim was soon followed by Kate, and then little Sam, the baby of the family. Daisy could still remember the moment she held each of them in her arms for the first time, the overwhelming love that filled her heart. They were everything to her, and George, with his steady presence, was the glue that held it all together. There had been struggles along the way, as there always are in any family. George had lost his job once, and Daisy had worked long hours as a nurse to make ends meet. There were sleepless nights, arguments, and disagreements, but through it all, their love remained the constant. They were a team, and together they overcame whatever life threw their way. Their children grew up in that house, running through the halls, making memories in the backyard, playing games in the living room. But as life often does, it changed. Tim went off to college and later settled in Chicago with his wife Michelle. Kate moved to California after meeting her husband, and the distance grew between them. Sam, the youngest, stayed closer to home but was always busy with his job and his own family. They all had their own lives now, and though they visited often, the house was no longer filled with the sounds of their laughter. Daisy thought back to the day George had passed away. It was one of those moments that felt both sudden and inevitable. She had been by his side through it all, the illness, the hospital visits, the gradual fading of his energy. And then, one quiet morning, he was gone. It was a shock, even though she knew it was coming. The months that followed were a blur. Tim and Kate came home for the funeral, but their lives were already moving in different directions. Sam was there too, but the grief was too heavy for anyone to express. Daisy felt as though she were left standing in the middle of a storm, surrounded by people but utterly alone. The silence that followed George's death was deafening. Daisy kept herself busy, working around the house, cleaning, cooking, doing what she could to keep the days from blending into one long, endless stretch of sorrow. The children, of course, came to visit when they could, but their visits were brief. Their lives were far away, and Daisy couldn't bear to be the one to ask them to stay longer. She didn't want to be a burden. So, she learned to live with the silence, filling it with the hum of routine, trying to keep moving forward despite the weight in her heart. In the years that followed, Daisy spent most of her time alone in the house. The house that had once been so full of life now felt like a monument to the past. She would often find herself sitting in the same spots where George and she had once talked late into the night. She would hear the echoes of their conversations in her mind, the sound of his voice still warm and comforting. And then there were the photographs. So many photographs. Pictures of their children growing up, of family vacations, of holidays spent together. Some of those photos had been taken in the backyard, some at the family cabin they used to visit in the summer. Each one held a story, a moment frozen in time, but also a reminder of how much had changed, how much had been lost. But it wasn't just the photos of George that Daisy found herself clinging to. It was the photographs of her children, too. Tim, Kate, and Sam. They had been the joy of her life. She loved them all dearly, but as they grew older and moved away, she had to learn to let them go, even if it meant being left behind. She had tried to stay involved in their lives, calling when she could, sending letters and visiting them when possible. But it wasn't the same. There were always other things to do, other responsibilities to tend to. Daisy understood that. She knew her children had their own families now, their own lives. But there was a pang in her heart, a longing for the days when they were all together. Those were the days when the house had felt full, when there was a purpose to every day, when laughter filled every room. Now, as she sat on the porch, alone with her thoughts, Daisy couldn't help but feel the weight of the years. She had given so much of herself to her family, and yet, in the end, it felt like they had slipped away. As Daisy looked out at the fading light, a soft breeze ruffled her hair. She wondered where they all were now, what they were doing. Tim, Kate, and Sam had their own lives, their own families. She didn't expect them to come back, not really. But she did wish for a little more time, a little more connection. She had given them everything she could, and now it was their turn. But sometimes, the silence that surrounded her seemed to scream louder than anything else. And that was when she thought about the box in the attic. The photograph of the child. Who was that child? Why had George never mentioned them? And why had she never asked? Daisy could no longer push these questions aside. They haunted her, tugging at her heart, demanding to be answered. The family she had built, the family she had fought for, loved with all her heart, was in some way still a mystery to her. There were pieces missing, pieces of the past that had never fully been understood, and Daisy knew that it was time to face them. Tomorrow, she would search for the answers. Tomorrow, she would open the door to the past and find out what had been hidden away for so long. The first loss. A fragmented family. The wind picked up as Daisy stood in front of the old oak tree, the one George had planted when they first moved into the house. Its branches were gnarled and twisting, and in the autumn, the leaves would turn a brilliant gold before falling, carpeting the ground with a blanket of memory. She had always found comfort in the tree, in its strength and quiet presence, just like George. It had been their symbol of endurance, of something unshakable in a world that seemed to change constantly. But today, standing there alone, it felt different. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of the past, and Daisy couldn't escape the feeling that something had been lost that could never be regained. It was a day much like this, many years ago, when their lives had changed forever. The phone call that morning had come without warning, a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday that had transformed into a day of heartbreak and loss. The voice on the other end of the line had been calm, too calm, and Daisy knew, even before the words came, that it wasn't good news. It was the kind of call you never want to answer, the kind that lingers in your mind long after the conversation ends, replaying over and over again. "Mrs. Saunders, I'm sorry to inform you that your husband George passed away this morning." The words seemed to hang in the air, each one sharp and cutting through the space between them. Daisy had heard them, but they hadn't truly sunk in at first. They couldn't. Not her George. Not the man she had spent the last 50 years building a life with. He had been her rock, her everything. How could he be gone? The rest of the conversation had become a blur. The phone call ended, but Daisy didn't hang up immediately. She just sat there, holding the receiver in her hand, staring out the window as though expecting to see George walk through the door any minute, with his warm smile and steady presence that had always brought a sense of calm. But he didn't walk through the door. He never would again. The shock had been almost suffocating, like trying to breathe through water. Daisy had sat in that same chair, in the very same spot where she now found herself, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. How could it be real? How could the world keep turning when her own had come to a halt? Tim had arrived first, rushing to her side from Chicago, his face pale and drawn. He had always been the one to act quickly, to take charge. But even his usual calm demeanor couldn't mask the grief that hung over him like a cloud. Kate had come next, flying in from California, her arms wrapped tightly around her mother, as though trying to shield her from the crushing weight of the loss. And then, little Sam, who had never been the emotional one, had come through the door last, his face crumpled with the kind of sorrow Daisy had never seen before. They were all there, her children, standing around her, but despite the presence of the people she loved most in the world, Daisy felt more alone than ever. The silence in the house was deafening. She had expected noise, the sound of George's voice, of life continuing as it always had. But instead, the house felt like a tomb, cold and still. She had never realized how much of herself she had tied to George until that moment. How much of her identity had been wrapped up in him. The funeral was a blur of faces and well-meaning words. People from the community, from the church, came to pay their respects. Daisy was grateful for their support, but it felt like they were all strangers. No one understood. No one understood how she felt to lose the person who had been with her through everything, to lose the person who had been her partner, her equal. The days after George's death were some of the loneliest Daisy had ever known. The children stayed for a while, but soon they had to go back to their lives. Tim had his job, Kate had her family, and Sam had his own responsibilities. Daisy had never expected them to stay forever, but when they left, it was as though the last vestige of her old life had walked out the door with them. She had learned quickly that grief was something you could never truly prepare for. It didn't follow any set path. There were no steps, no timeline. It didn't come in a neat little package. It was messy, it was painful, and it was ever present. The quiet was the hardest part. The silence that settled in the house after they all left was unbearable. The house that had once been full of laughter and chatter, of children running through the halls, of family dinners around the table, was now too still, too empty. Daisy found herself wandering from room to room, doing what she could to keep busy, to keep the memories at bay. She dusted the shelves, swept the floors, and folded the laundry, but nothing could fill the void that had been left by George's absence. The house felt like a shell, a place that had once been alive but now felt hollow. There were days when Daisy would sit in the living room, staring at the empty space where George's chair had been, and it was as if the very air around her was thick with his presence. She could almost hear him calling her name, almost feel his hand on her shoulder, as if he had never left. But then, the reality would come crashing down on her, and she would remember that he was gone, and she would be alone. The first few months were the hardest. There were times when Daisy thought she might not make it through. The nights were the worst, the long hours spent alone with her thoughts, with the grief that threatened to consume her. The weight of loss was so heavy, it was as if it would suffocate her. But over time, the pain began to dull, though it never truly went away. It settled into the corners of her heart, a quiet ache that would always be there. Daisy had learned to live with it, to accept the fact that George was gone. But she had also learned something else, that life, no matter how much you want to fight it, keeps moving forward. And that was the hardest lesson of all. The world didn't stop for her. It didn't wait for her to catch up. She had gone through the motions, finding ways to fill her days, but there was always something missing. The house, once so full of love, now felt like a place she was merely passing through, not a home. It wasn't until she had found the photograph in the attic that Daisy realized something else, something she hadn't known she was missing. There was a part of her life, a piece of her family's story that she had never fully understood. And now, with the photograph in her hands, that missing piece was calling out to her. Daisy couldn't put it off any longer. She had spent so many years hiding from the truth, avoiding the questions that had lingered in the back of her mind. But now, with George gone, it was time to face the past, to uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. It was time to find the answers. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the day she started searching for the truth. Tomorrow, she would find out what had been lost. The years of prosperity. Yet something was still broken. Time, they say, has a way of softening the sharpest of pains, of turning raw grief into memories that no longer pierce with such intensity. But it was never a perfect cure. Daisy had learned that over the years. While the sorrow of losing George had dulled somewhat, it had never truly disappeared. It was as though time had laid a thick layer of dust over the pain, but every once in a while, it was as if that dust was blown away, and the hurt was just as sharp and fresh as the day it had first entered her life. In the early years after George's passing, Daisy had kept herself busy. There was a rhythm to her days that had allowed her to get by, one step at a time. She still woke up early every morning, as she always had, the sun barely rising over the horizon. The house, despite its emptiness, was hers to maintain, and it gave her a sense of purpose. The early mornings were quiet, and she would sit in the kitchen with her cup of tea, gazing out the window at the garden that George had loved so much. She tended to it as best as she could, pruning the roses he had planted, trimming the hedges, keeping the flowers blooming. It was a quiet sort of life, but it was hers, and she found comfort in the routines she had built over the years. Her children came to visit occasionally, of course, but the visits were infrequent, and over time, they became more and more distant. Tim was busy with his work and family in Chicago, and Kate and her husband had a life that kept them in California. Sam, too, was preoccupied with his own career and family, often too tired from work to spend long periods of time with her. They all tried their best to keep in touch, but the connection that had once been so strong seemed to fade as they all moved in different directions. Daisy never complained, though. She had grown accustomed to being alone. Her life, while quieter than it had been, still had its rhythm. But still, there was something missing. She couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the years of relative peace and prosperity, something deep inside her was broken. Something that hadn't been fixed, something that was still raw and unhealed. And it wasn't just the absence of George. No, it was more than that. It was the silence that had replaced the laughter, the sense of disconnect that now existed between her and the family she had once known so intimately. Daisy spent her days in the house, doing what she could to keep herself occupied. She had found solace in gardening, in tending to the flowers that had been George's pride and joy. They were still beautiful, still colorful in the spring and summer, but the act of planting and nurturing them felt more like a ritual than a joy. She wasn't sure if it was for her anymore, or if it was just another way to hold on to the past, another way to keep George with her, even if it was only through the flowers. But there were other quieter moments too. Moments when Daisy would sit in the living room, staring at the empty chair where George used to sit. It had been years since he had passed, but there was something about the emptiness of that chair that haunted her. It wasn't that she couldn't move on. She had, in many ways. She had built a life after George's death, found ways to fill the void. But it was as though that chair was a symbol of everything that had been lost. It was the space he had left behind, and it was impossible to ignore. The silence in the house had become deafening, the weight of all the years of unspoken words and missed moments pressing down on her. It wasn't just the silence that bothered her, though. It was the unspoken tension that had settled between her and her children. Oh, they loved her. Of that she was certain. But it was different now. The closeness they once shared, the connection that had been so effortless when they were younger, had become strained over time. The visits were shorter, the phone calls less frequent, and Daisy found herself yearning for something that seemed so distant. The days when they had all been under the same roof, when they had laughed together, when they had fought together, when everything had felt real and full of life. There were moments when Daisy would watch her children with their own families and feel a pang of something, a longing perhaps, or a quiet sense of regret. She had always tried to be a good mother. She had worked hard to raise them, to give them everything she could, but she wondered sometimes if she had given too much. Had she lost herself in their needs? Had she given so much of herself that there was nothing left for her? She had always been there for them, always the steady one, always the pillar of strength. But what had become of her? What had happened to the woman she used to be? Daisy could still remember when she had felt truly alive, when the world was full of possibilities, when George was by her side and their children were all under the same roof. The house had been a home, a place of laughter and love. But now, it had become a place of memories. Sometimes Daisy wondered if her children still remembered the woman she had once been, the woman who had been their mother, who had been full of life, full of dreams, full of love. Now it seemed like all she had left were the quiet moments, the empty house, and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Yet despite all the years of solitude, Daisy still had a sense of pride in the life she had lived. She had raised good children, even if they had drifted away. She had built a life with George, and though he was gone, she still carried the lessons of their shared years with her. There was comfort in knowing that she had done the best she could, that she had loved fiercely and without reservation. But as the years passed, that quiet ache remained. Daisy had made peace with so many things, but not this, not the brokenness, not the distance between her and the family she had once known so well. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the way it was meant to be. Perhaps this was what aging was, a gradual, inevitable pulling away from the world, from the people you loved, until all that was left was a quiet, empty space. Still, in the depths of her heart, she knew that there was more to be discovered. There was something that had been left unresolved, something hidden in the past that still called to her. The photograph, the child she had never known. It was as if the past was not finished with her yet. It was as if there was a final piece of the puzzle that needed to be found before she could truly heal. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow, she would begin the search for the answers. The reminder. A little thing that changes everything. The days blurred together like watercolor paint spreading across a canvas. Time, which once seemed so abundant, now felt like a commodity slipping through her fingers. Daisy had settled back into her routine after George's passing, a routine that was comforting in its consistency. But lately, there had been a restless feeling stirring in her, a quiet discomfort that came and went like the shifting tides. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something that had been hiding just beneath the surface all these years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was one of those late afternoons in early spring when Daisy first felt it, a stirring in her heart, a momentary flicker that pulled her attention from the silence she had grown so accustomed to. She had been standing in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner, when the radio in the corner of the room crackled to life. At first, she didn't pay much attention. The music was soft, the kind of background noise that kept her company while she moved about the house. But then, the song that played made her pause, her hands frozen mid-motion. It was an old tune, a song she hadn't heard in years, not since George had been alive. It had been their song, the one they played on their wedding day, the one that had been their constant companion during those early years of marriage when they had little more than love to keep them warm. Unforgettable. That's what you are. The words floated through the air, delicate and soft, and for a moment Daisy's breath caught in her chest. The sound of the song, the voice of Nat King Cole, washed over her like a wave. Her mind immediately traveled back to the days when she and George had danced in their small living room, laughing together, young and carefree. She could almost feel his arms around her again, smell his familiar cologne, and hear the sound of his voice, low and soothing, whispering sweet nothings in her ear. But in that same moment, the warmth of the memory quickly turned to something else. It was a flicker of recognition. Something else was hidden in the memory, a detail she had long since buried beneath the weight of time. That song had always been associated with George, with their life together. Yet today, in the midst of the song's sweetness, Daisy's heart skipped a beat as she remembered something that she had long ago suppressed. The photograph. The photograph of the child. The song had brought the memory rushing back to her in a flood. That child, the one she had never been able to place, the one in the picture that had surfaced just days ago from the old chest in the attic. It was as if the universe had pulled back the veil, exposing the secret that had lain dormant for so long. She had buried it, yes, but the reminder had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of her mind. The child in the photo, that was the connection. The song had triggered it, bringing the long-forgotten memory into the light. For a moment, Daisy stood still in the kitchen, her heart pounding as the song continued to play. She had to sit down. Her legs felt weak as she lowered herself onto the old wooden chair by the kitchen table. The radio continued to play in the background, the song now weaving its way into her very soul. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, as a memory she had kept hidden resurfaced with startling clarity. It was a day in the early 1960s. Daisy could see it so clearly now, as if it had just happened yesterday. George had been at work, and she had been home with the children. Tim, Kate, and Sam had been running around the house, their laughter echoing through the halls. It had been one of those rare afternoons when everything felt right, when life was as it should be, full of joy and love. But then, the doorbell had rung. Daisy had answered the door to find a young woman standing on the porch, holding a child in her arms. The woman looked familiar, but Daisy couldn't place her. She was nervous, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether or not she should be there. The child in her arms, a little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, looked up at Daisy with wide eyes, her expression full of curiosity and uncertainty. The woman had said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think you need to see this child." And then, before Daisy could respond, the woman had quickly left, leaving Daisy standing there in shock, unsure of what had just happened. The child, though nervous, had stayed with Daisy, her little hand clutching Daisy's tightly, as if searching for some kind of comfort. Daisy had no idea who the child was, or why she had been left on her doorstep. And yet, something about the moment had stayed with her. The little girl had reminded Daisy of her own children, but she had never known who she was or where she had come from. The mystery surrounding the child had never been resolved. The woman had disappeared, leaving no trace, no name, nothing to explain the sudden appearance of the child in their lives. Daisy had never told George about that day. It had been too strange, too inexplicable. She had told herself that it was just some sort of mistake, that the woman had made a mistake in finding the wrong house. But the memory of that child had haunted her for years. The way the little girl had clung to her, the way she had looked at Daisy with those wide, innocent eyes, had never left her. And now, after all these years, that memory came flooding back with a vengeance. The photograph in the attic, the song on the radio, they had all come together, pointing to something that Daisy had tried to forget. But now, she could no longer ignore it. The truth was calling to her, louder than ever. As the song played on, Daisy's mind raced with questions. Who had that child been? Where had she come from? And why had George never mentioned her? What had happened to the little girl, and why had Daisy kept this secret for so long? The answer, she knew, was buried somewhere in the past. Somewhere deep within the memories she had tried to forget, hidden behind the doors she had never dared to open. But now, the door was cracked, and the truth was waiting to be discovered. Daisy knew one thing for certain. It was time to search for the answers. Tomorrow, she would begin the search. Tomorrow, the past would finally be uncovered. Awakening. The past starts to resurface. Daisy woke to the soft sound of birds singing outside her window. The air had a cool bite to it, a reminder that fall was creeping into the world, even as the sun slowly began its rise. She stretched and rolled over in bed, reaching for the clock on her nightstand. It was early, just before 6. The house was still, the silence stretching out before her like an old, familiar friend. But today, something felt different. She had woken up with a sense of purpose, a quiet urgency that hadn't been there before. The events of the past few days, the song on the radio, the photograph in the attic, they had all set something in motion inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her past calling to her. She had spent so many years running from it, burying it beneath the everyday routines of life. But now, it was demanding her attention. The mystery of the child, the secrets George had kept, they were no longer things she could ignore. She threw off the covers and slowly made her way to the bathroom. The reflection in the mirror was the same as it had always been. A woman with silver hair, lines of age drawn across her face, and eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. But there was something different in them today. Something sharper. Something more awake. For the first time in years, Daisy felt as though she was truly seeing herself again, as if the veil of time had been lifted, and she was looking into the eyes of the woman she used to be. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and turned toward the kitchen. The old house creaked under her feet as she moved, and she could almost hear George's voice in her mind, laughing as they once had while they shared morning coffee in this very room. But the laughter was gone now, replaced by a quiet that seemed heavier than it had been in the past. It was as though the house, too, was waiting for something. Daisy made her tea, the steam rising from the cup in delicate spirals. As she sipped, her mind wandered back to the photograph in the attic. It had stayed with her, refusing to let go. She could still see the child in the picture, her face uncertain, yet familiar. And then, the flash of memory from so many years ago, the woman at the door with the child in her arms. The strange sense of recognition that Daisy couldn't quite place. What was it about that moment that had always stayed with her? She had lived with the mystery for so long, but now the pieces were starting to fit together in her mind. The photograph, the song, the child. Daisy's heart raced as the thought crossed her mind. Had George known more than he had ever let on? Was this child, the one who had appeared on her doorstep all those years ago, a part of their family in some way? Had George kept a secret from her? One that was now begging to be uncovered? Her hands shook slightly as she placed the teacup down on the counter. She hadn't expected this feeling, this sudden pull toward the past. She had never thought to question George about the child, never thought to dig into the story behind the photograph. But now, as the years of silence stretched out before her, Daisy couldn't help but wonder, what had been hidden all these years? What had she missed? The first step, she knew, was to confront the past head-on. No more avoiding it. No more pretending that the questions didn't matter. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had happened that day when the child had been left on her doorstep. Who had the child been? Why had George never mentioned her? And why had Daisy kept it all locked away for so long? The attic. That was where it all began. Daisy could picture the chest, the one she had opened just days ago. Inside, there had been not only the photograph but other bits and pieces of the past. Old letters, journals, and trinkets that George had kept. But there was something more in that chest, something Daisy hadn't fully explored. It was time to go back to that chest, to dig deeper into the past, and to uncover whatever secrets it might hold. She stood up, her decision made. The house felt different now, as if it, too, was waiting for the inevitable unraveling of long-buried truths. Daisy walked slowly toward the stairs, the familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet. The air in the hallway was cooler, the light softer, and the house seemed to breathe with her. As she reached the attic door, she hesitated for just a moment, the weight of the past settling in her chest. The door was cracked slightly, and a sliver of light filtered through. She pushed the door open and climbed the narrow stairs, her heart beating faster with every step. The attic was the same as it had always been, dusty, filled with boxes of old things, forgotten memories, and bits of a life once lived. The chest sat in the corner, untouched, since that day she had opened it and uncovered the photograph. Daisy knelt down beside it and slowly lifted the lid, the smell of old wood and mothballs filling the air. Her fingers brushed over the old letters, the scraps of paper, the photographs that had once been treasured but now felt like pieces of a forgotten puzzle. She shifted through the items, one by one, until her hand landed on something she hadn't noticed before. A small envelope, yellowed with age, tucked beneath the bottom of the chest. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, written in George's neat handwriting. Daisy's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. "My dearest Daisy, if you are reading this, then you've come to understand the truth that I never had the courage to tell you. There is a child, a daughter of mine, one I could never bring myself to speak of. Her name is Lily, and she was born from a brief moment in my past. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't bear to tell you, to share the pain of that secret. I hope in time you will forgive me. Daisy's heart pounded in her chest as the words echoed in her mind. Lily. The name felt like a weight, a heavy burden she hadn't expected. George had a daughter from a time before their life together. The realization hit Daisy like a wave, drowning her in confusion and disbelief. Why had George never told her? Why had he kept this secret for so long? The child she had held in her arms, the child she had thought was nothing more than a stranger, was actually her stepdaughter. Lily, George's daughter, hidden away in the shadows of their life. And now, after all these years, Daisy had the answer she had been searching for. Tears welled up in Daisy's eyes as she sat in the attic, the letter trembling in her hands. The truth, long buried, had finally been uncovered. But the questions didn't end there. What had happened to Lily? Where had she gone? Why had George never brought her into their lives? Daisy knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over. She had to find Lily. She had to learn everything she could about her stepdaughter, the girl who had been kept from her all these years. It was time to seek the answers, no matter where they led. The search. In pursuit of the truth. Daisy sat in the attic for what felt like hours, the letter still clutched tightly in her hands. The faint smell of old wood mixed with the scent of the letter. And in the silence of the attic, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The truth was clear now. George had a child before they had met, a daughter named Lily, and for reasons she could never understand, he had kept this part of his life hidden from her, even after all their years together. Daisy could hardly believe it. She had lived with George for nearly 50 years, and in all that time, he had never mentioned Lily. Not once. How could he have kept such a significant secret from her? And why? What was the purpose of hiding a daughter, of keeping her existence so carefully concealed? Her mind raced as she pondered the questions, and though she had never considered herself a detective, she knew that she could no longer ignore the search for answers. If Lily was out there, somewhere in the world, then Daisy needed to find her. She had to know the truth. She had to understand why George had never shared this part of his life with her, and why Lily had remained hidden in the shadows of their family. The first step was clear. She needed to track down Lily. The letter, though painful to read, had given her a name. Lily. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was a start. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, and placed it on the floor beside her. Then, without thinking too much about it, she stood up, brushing the dust off her hands, and began to descend the stairs. Her mind was racing with possibilities. Where would Lily be now? How would she find her? Daisy knew she couldn't do this alone, not with the limited knowledge she had of George's past. The only thing she knew for certain was that Lily had to be somewhere. She had to have a family, a life, and most importantly, a place where Daisy could start her search. Once downstairs, Daisy quickly made a cup of tea, trying to steady her nerves. As she sipped the warm liquid, she thought about where to begin. George's past had been largely a mystery to her. They had never talked about his life before they met. It wasn't that they avoided the subject. It simply wasn't something either of them had discussed. George had always been a man of few words when it came to his past, preferring to live in the present, to focus on their life together. It was part of what made him so dependable, so reliable. But now, in the face of this new information, Daisy realized how little she really knew about the man she had spent most of her life with. The more she thought about it, the more Daisy realized that she didn't even know where to start looking for Lily. She didn't know if she had any family, if she had children of her own, or even if she was still alive. The only thing she had was the name, and that would be her first clue. With a new sense of determination, Daisy picked up her phone. The first call would be to Tim, her eldest son. He had always been the one who could help her navigate the complexities of life. His quick thinking and practical mind were invaluable. He was the first person she would turn to for help, though she knew he would be just as surprised as she had been when the truth was revealed. Still, he was her family, and he would want to help her, just as she had always helped him. When the phone rang, Daisy felt her heart flutter with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. She had never made a call like this before, not about something so personal, so overwhelming. "Mom?" Tim's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "What's going on? You sounded upset when you called." Daisy took a deep breath. "Tim," she began, her voice steady but edged with emotion, "I've just discovered something about your father. Something I never knew. George had a daughter before we met. Her name is Lily." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Daisy could practically hear Tim's brain working as he processed what she had just said. "Wait," he said finally. "A daughter? Before you met Dad? How is that possible? Why would he never tell you?" Daisy let out a sigh, sitting down in the living room as she explained the contents of the letter she had found in the attic. She told Tim everything she had learned, the photograph, the child, and the secret that George had kept from her all these years. "I need to find her, Tim," she said quietly. "I need to know who she is. Why did he keep her a secret from me? And where is she now? I can't keep living with these unanswered questions." Tim was quiet for a moment, and Daisy could hear him shuffling papers in the background. "Mom, I don't know what to say. This is a huge revelation, but we can figure this out together. We'll find her, I promise. We'll look through Dad's old things, his records, anything that might give us a lead." Daisy felt a surge of relief. "Thank you, Tim. I knew you'd help." They talked for a few more minutes, discussing possible avenues of investigation, any records, old addresses, or connections that might give them a starting point. Tim promised he would help, and Daisy felt comforted by the idea that she wasn't alone in this search. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much left to uncover. It was as if she were standing at the edge of a vast ocean, with no idea of what lay beneath the surface. As the conversation ended, Daisy sat back in her chair, the weight of the past still hanging heavily on her. The truth was no longer hidden, but it was still incomplete. She had a name, yes, but that was just the beginning. Where was Lily now? What had become of her? And what had George been keeping from her all these years? The search had only just begun, and Daisy knew one thing for certain. No matter how long it took, she would find the answers. She had to. A revelation. The hidden truth comes to light. The search for answers had begun in earnest, but as Daisy sat in her kitchen the next morning, holding the photograph of Lily in her hands, the weight of what she was uncovering seemed more daunting than she had expected. The world had always felt simple when George was by her side. 2 people, a house full of memories, and a life built together. But now it seemed as though the foundation of everything she had known was crumbling beneath her, revealing fragments of the past she had never even suspected. She had called Tim again that morning, and he had promised to dig deeper. They had agreed to go through George's old belongings together, searching for anything that might offer more insight into the mystery of Lily. Daisy had never expected to find herself on this journey, but now that she was on it, she couldn't back away. There were too many questions, too many unanswered pieces that her mind couldn't rest until they were resolved. Later that afternoon, Tim arrived at the house, his face a mirror of confusion and concern. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but the gravity of the situation was not lost on him. He could see it in Daisy's eyes, the uncertainty, the longing for answers that seemed just out of reach. The two of them spent the rest of the day combing through George's old desk, file cabinets, and boxes. It was strange, almost invasive, looking through his things with such a sense of purpose. In all their years together, Daisy had never once felt the need to delve into his past. She had trusted him, trusted the life they had built together. But now, with the truth of Lily hanging in the air, everything felt different. As they sifted through the yellowed papers, the brittle pages of old journals, and the odd assortment of mementos, Daisy couldn't help but feel a sense of violation. It was as though she were digging into a part of George's soul that he had chosen to leave untouched, a part of their life that he had kept hidden away. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. It wasn't until late in the evening that Tim found something. A letter, neatly folded, tucked between two old documents that appeared to be business contracts. The envelope was familiar, the same type of paper that George had always used for personal correspondence. Tim handed it to Daisy without a word, and her hands shook slightly as she unfolded it. It was short, to the point, and dated more than 20 years ago. The words on the page were unmistakably George's, written in his careful, steady hand. Daisy, there's something I've been carrying for a long time. Something I've never shared with you. Before we met, I had a relationship with a woman named Anne. It was brief, and it ended when I was still young, but it led to the birth of a daughter, Lily. I've kept this secret from you because I didn't want it to ruin what we had. I was afraid that if you knew about Lily, it would change everything between us. I know now that this was a mistake. I'm sorry. Please, Daisy, if you're reading this, know that I never stopped loving you. That was the only truth I could hold on to. Daisy's heart pounded as she read and reread the letter. Lily. The name had come to life once again, and the weight of the past seemed to press down on her chest. Anne. George had been with another woman before her, and their brief relationship had led to the birth of a child. This child, this secret, had been buried for so long. And now, with the letter in her hands, Daisy felt the full weight of George's decision to keep it hidden. Tim watched her closely, waiting for her to react. He could see the pain in her eyes, the confusion. This was a truth that Daisy hadn't been prepared to face. And yet, there it was, in black and white, confirming everything she had suspected. George had known about Lily. He had kept her existence from Daisy, hidden her from the life they had built together. Daisy sat back in her chair, the letter still in her hands, her mind racing. She had always known that George was a man of secrets, but this was something she had never imagined. It wasn't just the fact that he had kept Lily a secret. It was the betrayal. The years of living with the knowledge that her husband had a child, and yet had never once mentioned it. The question echoed in her mind. Why? Why had he kept this from her? Tim sat down beside her, his voice gentle. Mom, I know this is a lot to take in, but we can't change what's happened. What we can do now is find Lily. We can start looking for her, see if she's out there, and try to understand everything. Daisy nodded slowly, her thoughts a blur. I know, Tim. I can't believe it. All these years I thought we had everything. I thought we were building a life together, but now I see there was so much I didn't know." Tim reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You weren't the only one who didn't know, Mom. He kept this from all of us. We were his family. And I know he loved you. But whatever happened with Lily, whatever mistakes he made, that's his to carry, not yours." Daisy looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I need to find her, Tim. I need to understand why George kept her a secret, and I need to know what happened to her." Tim gave a small nod of understanding. "I'll help you, Mom. Whatever it takes." The letter had opened the door to a new chapter of Daisy's life, one that she hadn't expected to face. The truth of George's past, the hidden daughter, the secrets buried for decades. It was a lot to absorb. But Daisy knew there was no turning back now. She had to find Lily. She had to know the full story, no matter how painful it might be. The search for Lily had just begun, and Daisy had no idea where it would lead. But she knew one thing. She would not rest until the truth was uncovered. The revelation confronting the past. The following days passed in a blur of phone calls, searches, and endless questions that seemed to pile on top of one another. The letter from George had shaken Daisy to her core, and though she had hoped the answers would be clearer once she began the search for Lily, they only seemed to multiply. Every new lead raised more questions. Every piece of information she uncovered opened up new layers of the past, layers she hadn't known existed, and now she couldn't ignore. Tim had helped, as promised. Together, they reached out to old acquaintances, family friends, and even distant relatives. They went through old town records, birth certificates, and tried to track down anyone who might have known Anne, the woman George had been involved with before they had met. But every time they thought they were close, the trail seemed to fade just as quickly as it had appeared. George had lived a careful, guarded life, and his secrets were well kept. It seemed he had thought of everything, except the moment Daisy would stumble upon the truth. Daisy found herself sifting through more memories than she had expected, her mind drifting back to those years with George, to the love they had shared. She could still picture the first time they met. The way his eyes had sparkled with mischief, the warmth of his hand in hers, and the way he made her feel like she was the most important person in the room. Their life had been simple, and though they had gone through their struggles, Daisy had always felt certain of their love. But now, that certainty was clouded by doubt, by the realization that George had kept things from her, things that would have changed everything. One afternoon, after a particularly fruitless search, Daisy sat in the living room, staring at the photograph of Lily again. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. The little girl in the picture, the one she had once thought was a stranger, now felt like a part of her own story, a part of the family she had never known existed. And then there was the haunting question that lingered. Why had George kept Lily's existence from her? Daisy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden George had once tended to so carefully. The flowers still bloomed, but they didn't seem as bright as they used to. The world outside felt distant, as though it had slipped away from her, leaving her stuck in the web of unanswered questions. Just then, the phone rang, breaking the silence of the house. Daisy's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for a call from Tim, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found something that would lead them to Lily. She rushed to the phone and picked it up. "Mom, it's me." Tim's voice came through the line, filled with an urgency she hadn't heard before. "I think I've found something. I don't know how it'll help, but it's a start." Daisy's heart pounded in her chest. "What is it, Tim? What did you find?" "I found a letter," Tim said, his voice lowering. "It's not from Dad. It's from Anne, the woman he was with before you. It's old, but it mentions Lily. I think it's the piece we've been missing." Daisy's mind raced. A letter from Anne? She hadn't expected that. For all these years, she had never imagined that there might be a direct connection between Anne and Lily that could tie them to George's past. She had known about the relationship, of course, but the letter, it could be the key to everything. "Where is it?" Daisy asked, her voice trembling. "Can you bring it here?" "I'm on my way," Tim said. "I'll be there soon." Daisy hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. She had waited so long for this moment, the moment when everything might finally make sense. But now, with the letter so close, her nerves began to fray. What would it say? Would it give her the answers she so desperately needed, or would it raise more questions? A few minutes later, Tim arrived, carrying a small envelope, weathered and fragile, in his hands. Daisy could see the wear and tear on the edges, as if it had been passed through many hands, hidden away and forgotten. Tim handed it to her, and she could feel the weight of it in her hands. She opened it carefully, not wanting to tear the paper, and pulled out the letter inside. It was dated just a few months after George had passed away, and it was addressed to Daisy. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Daisy, I know that you've probably spent years wondering about George and the things he kept hidden. I know you may be angry, and I don't blame you for that. I've tried to reach out to you, but I was always too afraid. Too afraid that you wouldn't understand. But now, after all these years, I think it's time for you to know the truth. Lily is your daughter's half-sister. I know this will be a shock, but it's something that has weighed on me all this time. George and I were young, and we made a mistake. Lily was born of that mistake, but she was never a mistake to me. I raised her as best I could, but life got in the way, and I lost contact with her. I know this will be painful for you, but I hope that one day you'll find her, and that you'll give her the love she deserves. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can forgive me. Sincerely, Anne." Daisy's heart stopped as she finished reading. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the letter. Lily was her daughter's half-sister. The realization hit Daisy with a force she hadn't expected. The missing piece, the secret George had kept from her for so long, was now revealed. Lily wasn't just a child of George's past. She was part of their family. And now, after all these years, Daisy was being asked to find her. She had to find Lily, and she had to find out what had happened to her, what had become of her after all this time. Tim, who had been watching his mother closely, stepped forward and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Mom, I know this is a lot, but we're so close now. We can do this. We will find her." Daisy nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. The past, the pain, the confusion. It had all led to this moment. The truth was finally coming to light, and Daisy knew that there was no turning back. She had to find Lily. She had to make sense of it all. The past had come rushing back with a vengeance, and Daisy could no longer ignore it. The questions were finally being answered, but new questions were arising too. And now Daisy realized the search for Lily was no longer just about the truth. It was about healing, about forgiveness, and about the family that had been lost but never truly forgotten. The aftermath. The emotional toll of the truth. Daisy sat at the kitchen table, the letter from Anne lying in front of her, its words still echoing in her mind. Lily is your daughter's half-sister. The revelation had shaken her to her core, the weight of it still pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The photo of Lily, the child she had once thought was a stranger, now felt like a living, breathing part of her own story. The years of secrecy, the decades of not knowing, It all seemed to fall on Daisy in a single crushing wave. The truth was out. George had kept this secret for so long. A secret that now, in the aftermath of his passing, Daisy was left to piece together. It was almost as if George's voice was still lingering in the corners of the house, speaking to her without ever saying a word. The silence that had once been comforting now felt like a betrayal. How could he have kept such a monumental part of his life from her? Had their entire marriage been built on trust, only for it to be shattered in an instant? Tim had left the house after they had read Anne's letter together, and Daisy was left alone with her thoughts, her emotions a swirling storm inside her. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. She stood up from the table and walked slowly to the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass. The garden, which had once been a symbol of peace and tranquility, now seemed distant, like a place she didn't belong. The children, Tim, Kate, and Sam, they had their own lives, their own families. She couldn't burden them with her pain, with the weight of the past she had just unearthed. She couldn't bring herself to tell them about Lily, not yet. The truth was still too raw, too fresh, and she didn't know how to share it with them. The truth that their father, her late husband, had a child from a past she had never known. The family they had built, the life they had shared, now felt fractured, like pieces of a puzzle that had never quite fit together. Daisy's thoughts drifted back to the day she and George had met. She could still remember it so clearly. The way he had looked at her with such warmth, such sincerity, like he saw something in her that no one else did. The way they had shared their dreams together, building a life from nothing, raising their children with love, and creating a home that had once felt so full, so complete. And now, as she looked out at the empty space around her, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a vast unknown. She had spent her life loving George, trusting him, believing in the life they had built. But now, all of that seemed fragile, like it was slipping through her fingers. The questions were endless. Why hadn't he told her about Lily? Why had he kept it a secret, even when they were raising their children together? Was it guilt? Fear? A desire to protect her from something she could never understand? Daisy knew she would never have answers to all the questions swirling in her mind. George was gone. He had made his choices, and now it was up to her to figure out what to do with the truth he had left behind. The anger she had felt in the beginning had given way to something else, something deeper, more painful. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that she had spent all these years living in the shadow of a secret. The love she had given him, the trust she had placed in him, had it all been built on a lie? The pain was heavy, and Daisy found it hard to breathe, as though the air itself had become too thick. But amid the turmoil, one thought kept resurfacing. Lily. She had to find her. She had to know who she was. What had become of her? Lily was part of their family, part of George's past, and Daisy couldn't ignore her any longer. She couldn't let the past continue to haunt her without at least trying to piece it together. Daisy's hands were trembling as she reached for the phone again. She dialed Tim's number, her fingers shaking as she waited for him to pick up. When he did, his voice was calm, but Daisy could hear the concern in his tone. "Mom, how are you holding up?" Tim asked. "I'm okay," Daisy replied, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. "But we need to find her, Tim. We need to find Lily." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I know, Mom. We're already looking into it. I'll start contacting old records, maybe check for any family connections on Anne's side. We're not going to stop until we find her." Daisy nodded, even though Tim couldn't see her. I can't believe it, Tim. All these years, George kept it from me. I don't know how to feel about it. I understand, Mom. It's a lot to process, I know. But we'll get through this. We'll figure out what happened. Thank you, Tim, Daisy said, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know what I'd do without you. We'll get through this together, Mom. I promise. After the call ended, Daisy sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The past few days had been a blur of emotions, and she wasn't sure how to handle them all. The anger had faded into sadness, and the sadness into a deep, gnawing sense of loss. It wasn't just the loss of George, though that was a wound that would never fully heal. It was the loss of trust, the feeling that the man she had spent her life with had kept something so monumental from her. Daisy looked around the room, at the pictures on the walls, at the little trinkets they had collected over the years. Everything felt different now. Her world, once so solid and secure, now felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't let this ruin her. She couldn't let the past consume her. The truth had come to light, and though it was painful, Daisy would find a way to live with it. She would find Lily, and she would face whatever came next. She owed it to herself, to George, and to the family they had built. Daisy wiped away the tears that had gathered in her eyes, stood up, and walked to the window once more. The world outside was still there, unchanged, but she was different. The truth had a way of doing that. It changed everything. And now she would have to find a way to live in that new reality. Tomorrow, she would continue her search. Tomorrow she would take the first steps toward understanding the full story. And with each step, she hoped that, in time, the pain would lessen, and the answers would be enough to heal the wounds of the past. The final goodbye. Finding peace in the midst of uncertainty. The days following the revelation about Lily were a blur of phone calls, frantic searches, and most of all, reflection. Daisy had spent the past few weeks trying to digest everything that had come to light, but it felt as if the weight of it all was too much to carry alone. Every room in the house seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, of George, of the life they had built, and now, of the life Daisy was just beginning to understand. She had known George for nearly 5 decades, and yet, here she was, faced with a part of his life she had never known existed. Tim, her son, had been relentless in his search for answers. He had contacted records, scoured old town files, and even reached out to people from George's past. But Lily remained elusive. It was as if the universe was playing a game of hide-and-seek, taunting them with fragments of the truth, but never fully revealing the whole picture. The more they searched, the more the questions seemed to multiply. Daisy sat on the front porch one evening, watching the sun set behind the hills. The light was soft, fading into the horizon, and the world around her seemed to slow. In that moment, for the first time in weeks, Daisy felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace she had hoped for when she set out on this journey to find Lily, but it was peace nonetheless. It was the kind of peace that came with acceptance, the kind that whispered that sometimes the search for answers wasn't as important as the journey itself. The truth about George and Lily was still out of reach, but Daisy had come to realize something. The past, no matter how much we wish to change it, cannot be undone. George had kept his secret, and now that secret had become a part of Daisy's own story. But there was no changing that. The only thing she could control was how she moved forward. The only thing she could change was how she chose to carry the weight of the past with her. As the weeks passed, Daisy's sense of resolution grew. She had spent so much time wondering why George had kept Lily a secret, why he had never told her the truth. She had asked herself countless times whether she could ever forgive him for hiding such an important part of their life. But in the end, Daisy realized that forgiveness wasn't something she had to offer George. It was something she had to offer herself. She couldn't change what had happened. She couldn't change the years she had spent in the dark, the secrets that had been kept from her, or the pain that had come with the revelation. But she could choose how to live now. She could choose to let go of the anger, to release the burden that had been weighing her down. And in doing so, she would be free to move forward. Tim had called her earlier that day, his voice tinged with excitement. He had found something. A lead, a small piece of the puzzle that might bring them closer to finding Lily. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Daisy had promised to meet him the following morning to follow up on the new information. But even as she agreed to go, she knew that the search for Lily might never fully bring her the closure she had been hoping for. Daisy had never been one to let go of things easily. She had spent her life holding on to people, memories, and moments, even after they had faded away. But now, sitting on the porch, she felt something shift inside her. The love she had for George was still there, buried deep within her heart. But she was no longer chained to it. She had learned to let go, to release the past and embrace the present. The search for Lily, while important, would no longer define her. The night grew colder as the sky turned darker, and Daisy pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. She had done what she could. She had searched for answers, and now she was at peace with the uncertainty of it all. The next morning, Daisy met Tim at the small cafe in town. He had a file in front of him, the same one he had been carrying around for weeks. She could tell by the look on his face that he was both excited and apprehensive. "Mom, I think we're getting closer," Tim said as he slid the file across the table. "I found an address. It's not much, but it's a start." Daisy's heart skipped a beat. After weeks of searching, was this finally the breakthrough they had been waiting for? She opened the file and found a name, Lily Collins. The name sent a ripple of recognition through her, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. The address was a few towns over, in a small community Daisy had never visited. It was far from where George had lived, far from the life he had built with Daisy. "I don't know if this is her," Tim said, his voice filled with cautious hope. "But it's the only lead we have. We have to follow it." Daisy nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'll go," she said softly. "We'll find out." The drive to the address felt long, though the distance wasn't far. Daisy sat quietly in the passenger seat, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotion. She couldn't help but wonder what she would find when they arrived. Would Lily be there? Would she even want to meet Daisy? And if they did meet, what would they say to each other? What could Daisy say to her after all these years? When they finally arrived at the small house, Daisy felt her pulse quicken. It was modest, tucked away behind a neat row of hedges. The windows were framed with flowers, and the front porch looked like something out of a picture. It was a far cry from the cold, empty house Daisy had lived in for so long. The door opened before they even had a chance to knock. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise. She was older than Daisy had expected, perhaps in her late 40s, but there was something unmistakably familiar about her face. She had George's eyes. It was Lily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of the past. Daisy's heart was pounding in her chest as she took a tentative step forward. "I'm Daisy," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm George's wife. I've been looking for you. Lily's eyes softened and she stepped aside, gesturing for Daisy and Tim to come in. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for you." And just like that, after all these years, the truth was no longer a secret. It was not the resolution Daisy had expected, but it was enough. They would have time to talk, to piece together the missing years, to understand the past. And as Daisy stepped into Lily's home, she realized that sometimes the truth isn't just about the answers we find. It's about the peace we make with what we discover along the way. The quiet moment, finding peace in unexpected places. The small living room was cozy, filled with the soft light of the afternoon sun that filtered through the sheer curtains. The air smelled faintly of fresh herbs and something sweet baking in the oven. As Daisy stepped inside, she was struck by the sense of warmth that seemed to fill the room. It wasn't just the physical warmth from the gentle fire in the fireplace, or the scent of freshly baked cookies drifting from the kitchen. It was the warmth of something else. Something that, despite the years of separation and the heavy burden of the past, still lingered in the air. Lily motioned for Daisy and Tim to take a seat on the worn but comfortable couch. Daisy settled beside Tim, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart still racing from the suddenness of it all. She had never imagined she would be here, sitting in a stranger's living room, in front of the daughter George had kept secret for so long. Yet, here she was. The missing piece of the puzzle had been found. Lily, who had been standing near the doorway, took a deep breath and then sat down across from them. She was, Daisy could now see, a woman who carried both the weight and the grace of a life lived in the shadows. Her features were a blend of George's, the same brown eyes, the same strong jawline, the same way she tilted her head when she was listening intently. And though there was a softness in Lily's expression, there was also a quiet strength, a resilience that Daisy could not help but admire. For a few moments, no one spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the past, and the pain that both Daisy and Lily carried. Daisy glanced at Tim, who gave her a reassuring nod, silently encouraging her to speak first. But the words wouldn't come. How could they? What did she even say to this woman who, by all rights, should have been part of her life years ago? How could she bridge the gap of lost time, of the silence that had stretched for decades? It was Lily who broke the silence first, her voice soft but steady. "I know this is a lot," she said, her gaze meeting Daisy's. "I didn't expect you to find me, not like this. And I'm sure you have a million questions. I don't even know where to begin." Daisy looked at her, searching her face for something, some clue as to what was going on in her mind. What was Lily feeling? Was she angry? Confused? Relieved? Daisy wasn't sure, but she could sense the uncertainty in Lily's voice, the same uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks. "I guess I should start by saying I've been waiting for this moment," Lily continued, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I know it sounds strange, but I've always known this day might come. I've always known deep down that one day you'd come looking for me." Daisy's heart fluttered in her chest. "But why didn't you reach out sooner?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, but they were the ones she had been asking herself ever since she found the letter. Why had Lily stayed away? Why hadn't she come to Daisy with the truth, with the answers they both needed? Lily lowered her gaze, her fingers absently twisting the hem of her shirt. "I didn't know how," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know if you'd want to know me, or if I'd even be welcome in your life. For years, I didn't even know if George ever told you about me. And when I found out that he hadn't, well, it felt like everything I knew about our relationship had been a lie." Daisy nodded, feeling the truth of Lily's words deep within her. She had felt that same betrayal, the weight of the secrets George had kept from her. But hearing it from Lily, hearing the pain in her voice, made Daisy realize just how much the past had shaped them both, how the silence between them had been a burden they had both carried alone. "I understand," Daisy said softly. "I do. I don't even know what to say right now. I can't change the past, and I can't undo the years we lost. But I want to know you, Lily. I want to understand who you are and how you've been living all this time." Lily looked up at Daisy, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice thick with tears. "For years I was just alone. I mean, I had Anne, but she wasn't really my mother. She didn't know how to love me, or maybe she didn't know how to love herself. It's hard to explain, but I grew up knowing that I wasn't really part of anyone's family. I wasn't George's daughter, not in the way you were his wife. And I wasn't part of your life, Daisy. I was just an outsider." Daisy's heart broke at the words. She had been so focused on her own pain, her own questions, that she hadn't stopped to consider the pain Lily had lived with all these years. The truth was, Daisy hadn't known Lily at all. She had only known a name, a face in a photograph, and now the woman sitting before her was a person, with her own story, her own struggles. She wasn't just a stranger. She was family. "I'm so sorry," Daisy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew. I never understood. And I don't know how to make up for the years we lost, but I want to try. I want to know you. I want you to be part of my life, part of our family." Lily wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression softening. "I want that too, Daisy. I've wanted it for so long. But I don't know how we start. I don't know how to just pick up where we left off when there's so much time between us." Daisy smiled gently, her heart full of tenderness for the woman who had spent so many years feeling like an outsider. "We start with today," she said. "We start with getting to know each other. We start by sharing our stories, by being real with each other. And we take it one day at a time. That's all we can do." There was a long pause, and then Lily nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since they had met. "One day at a time," she repeated, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I think that sounds like a good place to start." And so, in the quiet of that living room, with the soft glow of the evening sun spilling over them, Daisy and Lily began to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic reunions, just two women sitting in a room together, trying to make sense of the past and finding a way forward. It was only the beginning, and there was so much to be done. But for the first time in a long while, Daisy felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. The truth, painful as it was, had led her to this moment. And in that moment, Daisy knew that no matter where the road ahead led, she had found something she had never thought possible. A new beginning, born from the ashes of the past. The conclusion, accepting the new reality. The days following the revelation about Lily were full of small, tender moments that were slowly beginning to stitch together the frayed edges of Daisy's heart. Though the pain of the past would always linger, there was now an undeniable sense of peace that had begun to take root within her. It wasn't a perfect peace, nor was it an instant transformation, but it was something. It was progress. And that Daisy had come to realize was enough. The house, which had once felt like a tomb of memories and unanswered questions, was beginning to feel like home again. But now, it was a home that was not only filled with the memories of her life with George, but also with the potential of the future. A future that now included Lily, the daughter George had kept hidden from her for so long. Over the past few weeks, Lily had come to visit regularly. They spent their afternoons talking, not about the past, but about the present. They shared stories of their lives, their struggles, their hopes for the future. It was as though they were learning to be mother and daughter all over again, but in a way that was unhurried, unpressured. There were no expectations, only the quiet understanding that they had both been through so much and had yet to find their way to one another. For Daisy, it was a strange but welcome feeling. She had spent so many years feeling alone in her grief, her anger, her confusion. But now, in this new chapter of her life, there was a sense of shared experience, of connection, that she had never imagined would be possible. She had thought that she had lost everything when George passed away. But in the process of discovering the secrets he had kept from her, she had found something else. Something she hadn't known she had been looking for all along. Lily, too, was finding her place in this new reality. There were moments of hesitation, of uncertainty, when the weight of the past seemed to surface. She wasn't sure where she fit into Daisy's life, or how to reconcile the years of absence with the new bond they were building. But she was trying, and that effort was enough for Daisy. One evening, after a long day of talking and sharing, Daisy and Lily sat in the garden together, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was painted with soft oranges and pinks, the air warm with the remnants of summer. It was one of those peaceful moments that Daisy had longed for, and as she looked at Lily beside her, she realized that the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was comfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people could share when they were truly at peace with one another. Lily was the first to speak, her voice soft but steady. "I never knew what it would be like meeting you, Daisy. I never knew how much I needed to know you until now." Daisy smiled, the expression warm and understanding. "I never imagined this either, Lily, but we're here now, and that's enough." For the first time since the day she had learned of Lily's existence, Daisy felt the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. The anger, the hurt, the confusion. It was all still there, but it was no longer the driving force in her life. She had made peace with it. She had made peace with George's choices, even if they were painful. And now, she could move forward, one step at a time. Over the following weeks, their relationship grew, not in the way Daisy had expected, but in a way that was authentic and real. They didn't try to fill the years of silence with words. Instead, they allowed their connection to develop naturally. They took things one day at a time, learning more about each other with each conversation. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, sharing the comfort of each other's presence. As much as Daisy had hoped for a grand reunion, she had come to realize that healing doesn't work that way. There were no shortcuts, no magic solutions. But what she had now, what she had found, was something deeper and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about creating something new. And that was enough. One afternoon, as the seasons shifted and the leaves began to turn golden with the arrival of fall, Daisy and Lily took a walk through the garden. The flowers George had once lovingly tended to were beginning to fade, but their beauty was still undeniable. The air was crisp, and the sun cast a soft glow over the landscape. As they walked side by side, Daisy found herself thinking about the life she had lived with George, about the secrets they had shared, and the ones they hadn't. She thought about the years of heartache and confusion, the things that had been left unsaid. But now, with Lily beside her, Daisy realized that the story wasn't over. It was just a new chapter, one that she had never expected to write, but one that was just as valuable as the rest. "You know," Daisy said, her voice quiet but full of meaning. "I never imagined that I would be here, walking through this garden with you by my side." Lily smiled, a soft, tender smile that reached her eyes. "Neither did I," she said, her voice full of emotion. "But I'm glad we're here now." Daisy took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. "I think for the first time in a long time, I can say I'm at peace with everything. Not because I understand it all, but because I'm ready to live with it. I'm ready to let go of the anger and the hurt and just embrace the life I have now." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think that's the hardest part. Letting go of the past and accepting what is. But it's also the most freeing." For a moment, they walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps on the gravel path, the only noise in the quiet afternoon. The weight of everything that had happened, the secrets, the pain, the unanswered questions, seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered now was the present. All that mattered was that they were here, together, moving forward. When they reached the end of the garden, Daisy turned to Lily and gave her a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you, Lily, for everything. For coming into my life when I least expected it, and for being patient with me. I know I've got a lot to learn about you, about the person you've become, but I want to. I really do." Lily smiled back, her eyes soft with emotion. "I want to learn about you too, Daisy. We have so much time to catch up on, don't we?" Daisy nodded. "We do, and we'll take it one day at a time." They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out at the garden, the sun now dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The world felt still, peaceful, as if it too was acknowledging the quiet understanding that had formed between them. Daisy had always believed that family was built on love, but now she understood that it was also built on forgiveness, on acceptance, and on the willingness to move forward, even when the past still lingered. For the first time in years, Daisy felt a sense of contentment wash over her. She wasn't looking for the perfect ending, the perfect closure. She had found something far more valuable, a new beginning, a new chapter. And with Lily by her side, the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. It was something they would face together. The message, a final reflection on love, family, and acceptance. Daisy stood at the window, looking out at the garden. The soft hues of twilight were falling over the house, casting long shadows across the path she and Lily had walked just hours ago. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle faintly in the sky, a gentle reminder that life kept moving, no matter what had happened in the past. It had been a long journey to get here, to this quiet moment of peace. A journey that had been filled with painful revelations, painful silences, but also moments of unexpected joy and healing. As she stood there, Daisy reflected on everything that had happened. The letter, the photographs, the discovery of Lily. All the questions that had haunted her for so long had been answered, even if the answers weren't what she had expected. George, her husband, the man she had shared so many years with, had carried secrets with him. Secrets that were now part of her story too. He had kept a part of his life hidden, a part of his past that had never been spoken of. But in discovering the truth, Daisy had also discovered something else. The capacity for forgiveness, for healing, and for moving forward. Lily. The word lingered in Daisy's mind, filling her heart in a way that she never thought possible. The daughter George had kept hidden had become a part of Daisy's life in a way that felt right, despite the years of silence. She had come into Daisy's life like a gust of wind, unexpected and powerful, shaking things loose, opening doors that had been sealed shut for far too long. And in her own quiet, gentle way, Lily had brought Daisy back to life. She had opened up a world of new possibilities, a new way of seeing the world, and perhaps most importantly, a new way of understanding family. The love Daisy had felt for George was still there, locked away in the corners of her heart, a love that had shaped her for most of her life. But now there was room for more. Room for Lily, room for new connections, room for a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of a family. Family wasn't just about the people you were born to. It wasn't just about the ties that were formed by blood. Sometimes family was about the people you chose, the people who chose you, and the people you connected with along the way. Family was about acceptance, forgiveness, and the willingness to move forward, together. Daisy's thoughts drifted to George again, and for the first time since his passing, she didn't feel the sharp pang of loss that had accompanied his absence. Yes, there was still grief. Grief for the man she had loved, for the years they had shared, for the things they had never said. But now, as she stood looking out at the garden, she realized that George had done the best he could. He had loved her, and despite the secrets, despite the pain, he had given her something precious, a life together. They had created something beautiful, something worth holding on to. And now, in the quiet of the present, Daisy knew that it was time to let go of the anger, to release the hurt, and to embrace the love that had always been there, even in the shadows. The house, once so full of grief and unanswered questions, now felt different. The walls that had once held the weight of silence seemed lighter now, filled with the promise of new beginnings. It wasn't that the past had been erased. It was still there, lurking in the corners, a part of their story. But now, it was a part of a larger, more complex story. It was a story of love, of loss, of redemption, and of moving forward. As the evening darkened, Daisy's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Tim. She hadn't heard from him in a few days, and she smiled as she read his words. "I've been thinking about everything. You've come a long way, Mom. I know this hasn't been easy, but you found a way to move forward. I'm proud of you, and I'm glad that Lily is a part of our family now. Love you." Daisy's eyes welled up with tears as she read the message. She hadn't expected it, hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words from her son. Tim had always been her rock, and now, seeing the way he had embraced the new reality, seeing how he had welcomed Lily into their family, filled her with gratitude. He had understood what she was going through, and he had never once judged her. He had simply stood by her side, offering his support without question. Daisy wiped the tears from her eyes and smiled. Life was messy, unpredictable, and often painful, but it was also beautiful in its own way. The love she had for her family, her children, Lily, and even George in his own way, was unconditional. It was a love that could survive the secrets, the pain, and the years of silence. It was a love that could heal, a love that could move forward. And that, Daisy realized, was what truly mattered. As she stood at the window, looking out at the night sky, Daisy thought about the message she would leave for herself, for Lily, for her children. It was a message that she hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't about finding the perfect ending, the perfect closure. It was about accepting the imperfections, about understanding that life is messy and complicated, and that we are all just doing the best we can with the hand we've been dealt. She whispered to herself, her voice soft but steady. Love is not about holding on to the past. It's about moving forward, even when the road is uncertain. It's about embracing the people who are meant to be in your life, no matter how they arrive, no matter when they come. And it's about forgiveness, because we all have our secrets, our mistakes, and our regrets. But we also have the power to choose how we live, how we love, and how we move forward. And as she finished her thought, a sense of peace settled over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought her here, to this moment, to this place where she could finally see the truth of her life, the love, the loss, the healing, and the new beginnings. Daisy had found the peace she had been searching for, and in doing so, she had found a deeper understanding of herself, of George, and of the family that she was still building, one day at a time. Tomorrow, she would continue to live, to love, and to embrace the uncertainties of the future. But tonight, she could rest in the quiet knowledge that, despite everything, she had found her way home. The story of Daisy and her journey of discovery and reconciliation offers profound lessons about the power of acceptance, forgiveness, and the courage to face the past. As we age, we often carry with us burdens of unresolved emotions, regrets, or secrets, things we might have hidden from others, or even from ourselves. Yet true healing begins when we accept the past for what it was and choose to move forward with love and understanding. Just like Daisy, we might encounter unexpected truths that challenge the way we've seen our lives or our relationships, but these moments also offer an opportunity for growth. Embracing the unknown, forgiving ourselves and others, and opening our hearts to new connections can transform our later years into a time of peace and fulfillment. This story teaches us that it's never too late to heal, to make amends, or to build new bonds that enrich our lives. Life may not unfold as we expect, but the choice to embrace each day with openness and compassion is always ours, regardless of age. Let us cherish the relationships we have, and be brave enough to seek understanding, knowing that it is through these connections that we truly find meaning in our journey. Thank you for listening, my friends. It's amazing how one revelation can change everything, isn't it? I hope this story touched something inside of you, just like it did with me. If you're enjoying these heartfelt stories, don't forget to share where you're watching from, and stay tuned for our next video. We'll continue exploring more moments in life that change us forever, so be sure to join us again. Take care, and I'll see you soon.